Now is the time to hold officials to account for their crimes against humanity that they have embarked on. So I call for an impartial human investigation into these human rights violence and to begin a process to secure justice for victims and their family. As we try to make sense of the incidents, we must ask uncomfortable questions of ourselves. I'm referring to the fact that British officials trained SARS police squad from 2016 up until this year, 2020, and they also trained the Nigerian army. Now I have to ask, what did this training actually entail? Could it have prevented escalation of this kind? Now, standing here as a proud British Nigerian, I implore the Minister and colleagues across the House to pursue answers to these questions and do what it can to facilitate Nigerians' fight for freedom. Popular debate, and it's unfortunate that my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, was not called to speak in this debate, and she sends her solidarity with the SARS movement. Now, I must begin by addressing the horrific violence we've seen inflicted upon young Nigerian civilians who were peacefully expressing their fundamental human rights against police brutality. As seen on media platforms, armed military officers discharge live ammunition at these peaceful protesters, injuring and killing them. It is, however, unfortunate that as of today, both federal and state government in Nigeria have issued conflicting statements on the event that occurred at the Lekki tollgate. This has left us with a series of yet still unanswered questions. Who exactly ordered the military to shoot live ammunition in a civilian territory? Why were bank accounts of some individuals who partook in the protest frozen? Mr. Chairman, if a democratic country deprives its people of their aspiration, livelihoods and voices, strips its people from their loved ones, forces them into hiding and instills fear of retribution through violent attack on free speech, then that country can only be a dictatorship disguised as a democracy. Is Nigeria a dictatorship? Now, having now asked this question, I leave the Nigerian public to decide that for themselves. I must now address the question of sanctions, which is what we are here to discuss. If we can ensure that these sanctions will not negatively impact civilians, whether directly or indirectly, then I do support a travel ban and asset seizures sanctions on individual officials found responsible. Now, while discussing sanctions is crucial to determining how we as a nation will respond to the violence recently accumulating in the SARS movement, it can only be the tip of the iceberg. And we must use our platforms to hold the Nigerian government accountable through more than just sanctions. We must do the right thing by the people in Nigeria protesting for their own human rights and ask the questions they've given us the platform to ask, which is, what role did the Nigerian government as a whole play in these attacks? Will there be an independent investigation into the over 100 cases of torture, rape, extrajudiciary execution?
One constituent wrote to me to say recently that she watched a documentary on how Nigerian military opened fire on unharmed children who were happily and peacefully demonstrating and carrying Nigerian flags. Many were killed mercilessly. She said she cried and said to me, "This could have been anyone." My constituents are right in demanding we see long-term action. A statement of condemnation, like my colleagues have mentioned just now, is not enough. As a country which subscribes to international human rights law, we must be quicker to act to support those who are having their rights infringed upon them around the world.
We still see some of those protesters still in detention today, and many others having financial restrictions and other actions taken against them. And I would be interested to know what assessment the Minister has made of the situation today with those who were involved in those protests. But of course, as many have explained today, this massacre and the other atrocities that we've seen are only part of the picture. They are part of a picture of brutality over a number of years, extraordinary brutality and violations by the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, otherwise known as SARS.
However, we must also take this opportunity to look beyond sanctions to a way in which development funding is spent in Nigeria. Instead of funding corrupt security services and investing in projects which do not benefit ordinary Nigerians, we need a new focus on poverty relief and anti-corruption programmes. Mr Gray, it is vital that we recognise the role of the UK and how these events have unfolded in Nigeria. Despite previously stating the opposite, the government has now admitted to funding SARS units for the last 4 years. That funding not only included the provision of training to those units, but the supply of equipment. At the very moment in which Amnesty International had declared SARS units to have been involved in extrajudicial killings, corruption and torture, the government was using the aid budget to train and equip those units. In fact, between 2016 up to this year, more than 10 million went towards programmes from which SARS units benefited. That is not only immoral, it makes it harder for UK to play a positive role in Nigeria during this vital period. How can the government, with a straight face, call for an end to violence against protesters, having helped train and equip the security forces who are carrying out that violence? So today, I hope the Minister will publicly apologise for the decision to fund SARS units and pledge a full and independent inquiry into this matter. Mr Gray, the 20th of October 2020 will be remembered as the Lekki tollgate massacre. The day a deliberate and coldly calculated attack on peaceful Nigerian civilians was carried out by the Nigerian army. The Nigerian government has since taken part in an attempted cover-up of this massacre. Security forces in Nigeria make muted responses to the murder of protesters. While governments across the world have called on the Nigerian government and the security forces to stop killing protesters.
Given the shared history between the UK and Nigeria, and as a fellow member of the Commonwealth and ally, the UK has its duty to stand up for human rights of Nigerian citizens. In the case where Nigerian officials are avoiding accountability over the killings of protesters, I believe that the UK should be looking to impose sanctions on state officials involved in the human rights abuses of Nigerian citizens. In July of this year, the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Developmental Affairs introduced the Global Human Rights Sanctions Regulations. Under this statutory framework, priority themes relate to cases that threaten media freedom and human rights defenders. Furthermore, another priority theme considers cases where the relevant jurisdiction law enforcement authorities have been unable or unwilling to hold those responsible for human rights violations or abuses to account. The government clearly have the tools to ensure that Nigerian state officials respect the constitutional and fundamental human rights to protest and free speech. If those who ordered and facilitated the killings and harm to protesters are not held accountable, then the UK government should advocate for independent investigations to take place. And following investigations, any individuals found responsible for these atrocities of human dignity.
Foreign colonialism, The pressure instead is corruption and violence and attempts at control. And that's why I totally agree with my honourable friend, the member for Edmonton. We need to call out the corruption. We need to use the powers that we have in this country to stop those who are profiting from the wealth of that great nation and hiding it here. Now, some people will remember when General Gowon left Nigeria with half the central bank, so it is said, and moved to London. We know that today, even now, in this great city of ours, there are, sadly...
Order. We now come to a debate entitled this House considers a petition relating to Nigeria and the sanctions regime. I call Theresa Villiers to move it.
Thank you, Mr Gray. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 554140 relating to Nigeria and the sanctions regime. I'd like to thank the 220,330 people who have signed this petition, or at least had done when I last checked it this morning, especially the 853 of them who are my constituents in Chipping Barnet. This petition has been prompted by the disturbing events in Nigeria over recent weeks. there have been widespread protests regarding the activities of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad of the Nigerian police, known as SARS. This unit has a deeply controversial reputation, and the hashtag #EndSARS started to appear prominently on social media back in 2017. Reports of violence and human rights abuses by SARS date back several years, but these latest protests followed circulation of a video in early October, shockingly, which many believe shows a man being killed by SARS officers. On the 11th of October, President Buhari announced plans to disband the unit. However, such promises have been made in the past, and yet SARS seemingly has continued to operate. This would in fact be the fourth time it was abolished. Many protesters therefore felt that disbanding SARS, even assuming it happens, would not be sufficient to tackle long-standing problems with police brutality, particularly if SARS officers are simply assigned to different parts of the police service. Activists are now calling for a complete overhaul.
Just reiterate the point that, on sanctions, it is a long-standing practice not to speculate on our future sanctions, as this could reduce the impact of those very sanctions. Honourable members, Mr Gray, have mentioned and raised the issue of corruption, and I agree with honourable friends that tackling corruption in Nigeria is absolutely critical to the country's prosperity and security, and to reducing poverty and inequality. And work is underway to consider how a global corruption sanction regime could be added to the government's armoury. Members also raised the issue of intimidation, and I would like to just touch on that, because I think most members here today, or several members certainly, gave examples of intimidation that had been highlighted to them. And we are aware, Mr Gray, that some protesters have reported facing intimidation, and the British High Commissioner in Abuja continues to raise our concerns about intimidation of civil society groups and peaceful protesters with the Nigerian government.